The night began like a whisper, snow falling slow and heavy, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to stop. It wasn't only cold that filled the air that night. It was memory. The kind that drifts through small towns where time moves slower and every streetlight remembers someone's story. Inside a flickering diner on Maple Street, Clara Wynn stayed long after the world had gone to sleep. The coffee pot had fallen silent hours ago, but she kept wiping the same counter, not because it was dirty, but because it was familiar. The register held more bills than tips, along with a folded note from the owner that began with "I'm sorry" and ended with "for sale." She could have gone home, locked the door, pretended she didn't hear the storm outside. But something kept her there, something that sounded a lot like hope. Maybe it was the way the walls seemed to breathe when the wind pressed against them, or the way the clock ticked like an old friend reminding her that even when everything changes, some places are worth staying for. So she stayed, alone but not lonely, waiting. Because deep down, Clara still believed in the kind of kindness that doesn't wait for an audience, the kind her grandmother used to talk about over cocoa and fading sunlight. During a snowstorm, when the world went quiet, she stayed behind not for pay but for peace. Maybe some part of her still believed that kindness should never clock out. Outside, the storm grew stronger, the snow fell thicker, and beyond the glass, unseen but drawing closer, fate was already walking toward her door. The door opened with the soft chime of a bell that sounded older than the town itself, a note that carried through the hush like the echo of another life. Cold air swept in, carrying with it the scent of snow and silence. For a moment, Clara thought it was just the wind trying to get warm, until she saw the figure standing there. An older woman filled the doorway, small, shivering from the cold, her coat too thin for that kind of winter, but her eyes still bright beneath the snow. The snow had settled on her shoulders like dust on a forgotten photograph. Her hair, silver and tangled, clung to her face. She looked like someone who had stepped out of the past and gotten lost on her way back. Clara didn't ask questions. She simply moved instinctively, the way kind people do when someone needs them. She fetched a blanket from behind the counter, guided the woman to a booth near the heater, and poured a cup of hot tea that steamed between them like a small, temporary sunrise. The woman's hands shook as she held the cup. She whispered her name, Margot. Margot Hale. Her voice carried the delicate weight of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing silence over complaint. She thanked Clara with a tired smile that almost broke her own heart. As Margot sipped her tea, her eyes wandered around the diner, tracing every crack in the tiles, every faded photograph on the wall. Her gaze lingered on the old jukebox in the corner, the one that hadn't worked in years. A faint light flickered in her eyes, something halfway between recognition and longing. She didn't just see a diner, she saw them. The laughter of children sharing milkshakes. The smell of her father's aftershave as he leaned across the table to pay the check. The jingling of coins, the soft hum of a tune that used to play when love was simpler and mornings were long. She touched the edge of the table and sighed. The wood was worn smooth, but to her it felt the same. The years fell away like snow melting on glass. For a few seconds, she wasn't a woman running from the cold. She was a little girl again, swinging her feet beneath the booth, waiting for pancakes that always came with too much syrup. Claire noticed the look in her eyes, that far-off shimmer people get when they've traveled back somewhere in their hearts. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Some silences are sacred, and she'd learned that kindness isn't only in what you do. It's in what you don't interrupt. Margot finally spoke. "It's strange," she said softly, "how some places remember us even when we forget them." Her words trembled like the steam curling from her cup. Clara nodded, though she couldn't fully understand. Yet she felt it, the strange weight of nostalgia, how it fills a room without asking permission. Outside, The storm moaned through the trees, pressing against the windows like an impatient ghost. Inside, warmth grew between two strangers who hadn't meant to find each other. The ticking clock on the wall was the only sound, marking the moment that would change everything. Clara smiled. "You can stay as long as you need," she said, her voice gentle, steady, the kind that belongs to people who've learned how to survive quiet seasons. Margot looked at her, eyes shining with the kind of gratitude that doesn't fit into words. For the first time that night, the storm seemed to soften as if it, too, had found something worth listening to. And while the snow kept falling outside, covering the streets, the rooftops, the world, inside that little diner, two souls thawed slowly in the same light. They didn't know it yet, but this small act, one of warmth and one of memory, was the beginning of a story the town would remember for generations. A story about how, once upon a snowstorm, kindness met nostalgia, and the world became a little less cold. The storm outside was relentless, but inside that small diner, time began to soften. The snow tapped gently against the glass, like it was knocking just to be let in. The world had shrunk to the size of that room. Two women, a flickering light, and a silence that somehow felt alive. Clara poured another cup of coffee, not because it was needed, but because the sound of it, that slow pour, that gentle clink, felt like company. The air smelled of roasted beans, melting snow, and the faint perfume of history. There's a certain kind of peace that comes only from small places, places where the world used to gather before it learned to rush. Margot's eyes were still wandering, and Clara noticed how they always returned to the same spot, the wall behind the counter, where a faded photograph hung crookedly under a film of dust. In it, a group of strangers smiled. Men in suspenders, women in aprons, a child holding a slice of pie bigger than her face. "That was the old owner," Clara said softly, following her gaze. "He built this place right after the war. Said the town needed a reason to smile again." Margot's lips curved, almost without her permission. "I remember," she whispered. "My father used to bring me here. I couldn't have been more than 6. He always ordered black coffee for himself, hot chocolate for me, and blueberry pie for both of us." Her voice cracked slightly, and the sound of it pulled at something inside Clara, the kind of ache that isn't pain, but longing. The ache you feel when you realize that everything you miss is still here, just changed. Margot looked around again, seeing not what the diner was, but what it had been. "The floorboards used to creak in the back," she said, smiling faintly. "And that old jukebox. Oh, that thing never worked right. My father would hit it twice, and somehow it would start playing anyway. He used to say some things in life just need a little nudge to sing again." Clara laughed quietly, not the kind of laugh that fills a room, but the kind that warms it. "Sounds like he loved this place." "He did," Margot said, her eyes far away now. "And I think I did too. This was where I learned that people were good. That kindness wasn't rare, it was everywhere if you looked hard enough. The words hung between them, tender and true." The heater hummed softly, keeping pace with the storm outside. Clara leaned back against the counter, her hands folded in front of her apron. "It's a shame," she said, hesitating as if she were afraid to break something delicate. "The owner's selling it. He can't keep up with the bills anymore. Says the building's worth more as a parking lot than as a place to eat." The look on Margot's face changed. Her eyes dimmed for a moment, as if someone had taken away the color from her memories. "Selling it," she repeated. Clara nodded. "I've been working here since I was 20. I always dreamed of owning it someday, keeping it alive, you know? But dreams like that, they don't fit on paychecks like mine." Margot said nothing for a while. She just looked at Clara, really looked. And what she saw wasn't pity or failure. It was the same quiet strength she remembered in people from a different time. People who did what needed doing because it was right, not because it was profitable. Finally, she spoke. "You remind me of someone," she said. "My father. He believed that places like this, small, ordinary places, were the heartbeats of a town. He used to say, 'It's not the coffee that keeps people coming back. It's the feeling that someone remembers your name.'" Clara smiled softly. I think he was right. The wind outside howled again, but neither woman flinched. The diner felt untouchable, a tiny world preserved under glass, protected by kindness and memory. Margot set her empty cup down, tracing the rim with her fingertip, almost like she was writing something invisible. "You know," she said, "there's something beautiful about people who stay behind when everyone else has gone home. Maybe that's how miracles start, not with noise, but with someone refusing to leave." Clara didn't answer right away. She was staring out the window, where the snow drifted past the neon sign that read Maple Street Diner. It flickered weakly, as if it too was fighting to stay alive. After a long pause, Clara whispered, "I guess I just can't stand the thought of the lights going out for good. This place has been here longer than I've been alive. Feels like if it goes, a part of the town does too." Margot nodded. "And maybe that's why you're here tonight. Maybe you weren't meant to save it with money, but with something else." Clara turned back to her, confused. "With what?" Margot smiled, her eyes glimmering like the reflection of an old photograph. "With the one thing this place was built on, heart." Outside, the snow began to slow. The storm wasn't over, but it had eased, like it, too, wanted to listen to the conversation inside. And somewhere deep in that storm, something unseen began to shift. Fate, perhaps, or memory, or maybe both. Because that night, in a diner that was about to die, two strangers unknowingly began to breathe life back into it. Not with plans or profit, but with something the world often forgets. Simple human goodness. It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes in the quietest corners of the world, two souls meet by chance, and in doing so, remind each other of everything worth saving. Morning crept in slowly, almost shyly, like it wasn't sure it was welcome after a night like that. The storm had finally tired itself out, leaving behind a town blanketed in quiet. Snow lay heavy on rooftops, untouched and pure, turning every corner into a photograph from a time long gone. For a while, there was nothing. No sound but the hum of the heater, no movement but the lazy swirl of steam rising from two forgotten cups. Clara stood behind the counter, staring out at the white world. The roads were invisible, the horizon a soft blur of silver and blue. It felt like standing in a dream. One of those fragile dreams you try to hold on to after waking, but it always slips through your fingers. Margot was still asleep in the booth near the window. Her head rested against the vinyl cushion, a thin blanket pulled to her chin. Her face looked peaceful now, almost childlike, and for a brief moment, Clara wondered what kind of life she lived, what kind of stories hid behind those tired eyes. The quiet was complete until the faint rumble of an engine broke it. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong to small towns, deep, confident, and out of place among the muffled hush of snow. Headlights cut through the frost, gliding slowly up the empty street. A black car, sleek and polished, stopped outside the diner. Clara's first thought was that no one sane would drive in that weather, not after a night like that. Her second thought came too late. The door opened, and in stepped a man whose presence changed the air before he said a word. He was tall, his coat sharp against the softness of the room, his shoes too clean for snow. He didn't shake off the cold, he carried it in with him. His eyes swept across the diner, scanning everything with the precision of someone used to taking ownership of every room he entered. He didn't notice Clara at first. His gaze landed on the booth by the window, on the sleeping figure of the old woman wrapped in blankets. Something flickered in his face then, something brief and human, before control returned like a mask. He stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Mother." Clara froze. "Mother." She looked between them, the man of money and confidence, and the woman she had mistaken for a lost stranger. Margot stirred, blinking against the morning light. When she saw him, her eyes softened, but not with surprise. It was the look of someone who had been expecting this moment and was quietly relieved it had come. She smiled, tired but warm. "Rowan," she said simply. He let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief. "You had me worried sick." Margot chuckled faintly. "You've always worried more about appearances than people, darling. Some things never change." It was said with love, but Clara felt the edge beneath it, the kind of edge that comes from years of distance. Rowan turned then, finally noticing her. His eyes, sharp, analytical, unreadable, lingered on her uniform, the empty tables, the old coffee pot still steaming faintly behind her. "You're the one who called?" he asked. Clara shook her head. She came in on her own. The storm was too bad to go back out. There was a pause, not rude, just long enough for tension to settle in. He studied her for a moment, as if he were trying to understand why a woman like her had stayed open in a storm like that. "She could have frozen," he said quietly. "Thank you for staying." Clara nodded once. Someone had to. And there it was, the difference between them, drawn out in one simple line. He dealt in efficiency, she dealt in empathy. He was used to solving problems. She was used to seeing people. Margot spoke again, her voice gentle but full of knowing. "She didn't just keep me warm, Rowan. She kept me company. There's a difference." The son looked at his mother, the faintest hint of guilt flickering behind his calm expression. He had money, power, reputation, but she had something he had lost along the way: heart. He turned to Clara again. "You shouldn't have risked staying open," he said, his voice softer this time. Clara met his gaze. "I wasn't thinking about risk." For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Margot said something that neither of them would forget. "Funny, isn't it? How the places that raised us still have lessons left to teach." Rowan frowned slightly. "You've been here before?" Margot smiled, her eyes moving across the diner like someone tracing a map she once knew by heart. "Many times," she said. "This diner was my childhood. Your grandfather used to bring me here every Sunday. Same window. Same smell of butter and burnt coffee. The same jukebox that still doesn't work." Rowan followed her gaze, and for the first time, the sharpness in his face softened. He could almost see it, his mother as a child, feet swinging beneath the table, face lit up by the simple joy of being loved. Something about the place tugged at him, a faint sense of déjà vu, as if he'd sat in that booth before long ago when life was simpler. He looked around again. The diner wasn't just a building. It was history, memory, legacy, and now, thanks to one woman's kindness, it was still standing. Margot reached for her son's hand. "This place gave me warmth once," she said quietly. "Last night, it gave it back to me again. Maybe that's worth something." Rowan didn't answer right away. He just nodded, a faint smile ghosting across his face, the kind that doesn't belong to a businessman, but to a boy remembering where he came from. Clara stood quietly, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly something sacred. She just watched, two lives reconnecting in a room that had seen decades of stories, laughter, and loss. It struck her then that maybe every place, every wall, every table, every photograph holds onto the pieces of who we used to be, waiting for us to come back. And in that moment, the snow outside didn't feel so cold anymore. Because sometimes people don't just walk into a diner. They walk back into their own lives. And for Rowan Hale, the billionaire who thought he was only there to find his mother, it was the beginning of finding something much greater. The pieces of himself he'd forgotten he'd left behind. The hours that followed felt suspended, like time had taken a seat beside them just to listen. The storm outside had long passed, but inside the diner, the air still shimmered with its echo. It smelled of butter and coffee and something older, something that didn't belong to the morning, but to the past. Margot sat by the window with her son across from her, the sunlight soft on their faces. For years, they had spoken through screens, through assistance, through distance. But now, they were speaking through silence. And in that silence, more was said than words could hold. Rowan watched his mother's hands as they rested on the table, delicate hands, marked by time, but steady in a way that made him realize just how long she had been the anchor he'd drifted from. He had built towers, companies, legacies, but he hadn't built time with her. And now here she was in a small town diner, smiling over a cup of coffee like the world had never gone wrong. He wanted to ask why she had come here, why she'd risked everything to wander into a storm. But before he could, Margot spoke first. "You used to have pancakes here when you were little," she said quietly, her eyes still on the window. Rowan blinked, trying to remember. She smiled. "You wouldn't remember, of course. You were only 4. Your father was still alive then. He'd hold your hand as we sat right in that booth." Her voice wavered, but she steadied it, tracing her fingers along the wooden edge of the table. Back then, this place was always full. Soldiers returning home, families celebrating paydays, travelers resting between towns. It was more than food. It was warmth. And warmth, she paused, was rare even then. Rowan glanced around the room. The booths were empty, the jukebox dusty, the neon sign outside flickering between life and exhaustion. He could almost see the ghost she spoke of. Men laughing, waitresses balancing trays, a little girl swinging her legs beneath the table. He imagined his father there, smiling, alive in a moment that belonged only to the memory of this place. "This diner," Margot said softly, "raised me. Your grandfather brought me here after my first recital. He used to say it had a soul, that some buildings do if the right people pass through them." She looked up at her son then, and for the first time that morning, he saw tears in her eyes. "I thought it was gone. When I saw its faint neon through the snow last night, I almost couldn't believe it still stood. And last night, when I saw that sign through the snow, it was like seeing an old friend call my name." Rowan swallowed hard. He was a man who dealt in logic and results, who built empires and dismantled emotions. But at that moment, logic didn't belong here. This was a place of feeling, of echoes, of ghosts that refused to be forgotten. Clara stood quietly by the counter, wiping cups she'd already cleaned, pretending not to listen. But she was listening, every word of it. Because in Margot's story, she heard her own. A woman trying to keep something alive when the world had already given up on it. After a long silence, Rowan spoke, his voice low, measured. "So you came here because of this place?" Margot nodded slowly. "I came here because I wanted to feel something real again. And then I met her." She nodded toward Clara. "She didn't know who I was. She didn't care. She gave me warmth when I had none left to give myself." Clara blushed faintly, looking down. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said softly. Margot smiled knowingly. "No, my dear. That's what makes it special. Most people wouldn't." Rowan looked at Clara differently now, not with the polite distance of a man used to being served, but with the quiet curiosity of someone meeting a rarity. He noticed the tiredness in her eyes, the careful way she moved. Even exhaustion couldn't dull the kindness in her. He cleared his throat. "How long have you worked here?" Clara hesitated. 8 years, since before the renovation scare. Her voice faltered just slightly. The owner's selling it soon. He's tired of fighting to keep it open. Margot's expression changed, sorrow mixed with determination. Selling it, she repeated, almost to herself. When Clara nodded, Margot's gaze drifted around the room again, as if she were memorizing every scratch, every light fixture, every story left behind in the walls. She placed her hand on the counter and whispered, "After all these years, this place still remembers." Clara frowned gently. "Remembers what?" Margot looked at her with eyes full of old summers and soft mornings. "Kindness," she said. "It remembers kindness." The air seemed to thicken after that. Even the sunlight changed, as if it, too, wanted to listen. Rowan leaned back, watching the two women, one who had built empires, one who had held onto hope in a diner too small to save. And somewhere in between them, he felt the weight of what his life had become. All his meetings, his mergers, his victories, none of it had ever made him feel what he felt now. In this tiny corner of Vermont, where his mother's memories and a stranger's compassion had somehow collided, he thought of his father, a man he barely remembered, and wondered if this was what he had meant when he used to say, "Success means nothing if you forget what home feels like." Margot reached across the table and took his hand. "Rowan," she said quietly, "you've built 1,000 things, but this is what builds us. This place, this feeling, these people." He looked at her, then at Clara and nodded. Something inside him, something long frozen, began to thaw. It was small, barely noticeable. But for the first time in years, Rowan Hale felt something close to peace. He didn't have the words for it yet, but Margot did. She smiled softly, her hand still resting on her son's. "Some memories," she said, "don't fade. They wait for the right hearts to return." And as she said it, the old neon sign outside flickered again, buzzing weakly but refusing to die. Just like the place it guarded, just like the warmth inside those walls, just like the hearts it had managed to bring together one more time. Evening returned like an old friend who'd learned to knock before coming in. The snow outside had begun to melt, leaving little rivers that whispered through the gutters, carrying the memory of the storm away. The town, half asleep beneath the glow of streetlights, seemed gentler now, as though something unseen had been forgiven. Margot and Rowan stood outside the diner for a long while after closing. Inside, the lights were dimmed, the air still heavy with the smell of coffee and comfort. The window reflected them, mother and son, but also the ghost of another time. A man's laughter, a child's giggle, a simpler world where love wasn't lost to ambition. Margot's fingers brushed the glass, tracing invisible patterns on its surface. Her touch trembled, not from the cold, but from nostalgia too deep to name. She turned to her son and smiled, a small, tired smile, the kind that carries both joy and regret. "You know," she said softly, "when I was a little girl, I thought this diner was the whole world." Rowan looked at her, his face softened now, his voice low. "And now?" She chuckled faintly. "Now I think maybe it still is." For a moment, they just stood there, a billionaire and a woman who had braved a snowstorm to chase her memories. But titles didn't matter anymore. In the reflection, they were simply people again, caught between what was and what could still be saved. Margot sighed. "I keep thinking about that girl, Clara. She didn't know who I was, and she didn't care. She saw someone cold, and she helped. No hesitation. No questions." Her voice broke just slightly. "That kind of heart is rare now." Rowan nodded slowly. "It is." Margot turned her gaze toward the diner again, her expression softening into something like resolve. "She told me the owner is selling it. The place is going under." Rowan frowned. "I'm not surprised. Places like this can't survive forever." Margot shook her head, her tone gentle but firm. "Places like this should survive. They're reminders, anchors. They hold people together when everything else pulls them apart. The world needs its small places, Rowan. The ones that still remember how to care. He looked at her, listening in a way he hadn't in years. She went on, her voice steadier now. If you want to do something for me, don't buy me flowers or another house I'll never live in. If you really want to honor me, she gestured toward the diner, save this. Let her run it. Rowan blinked, as though trying to make sense of what she was asking. Let Clara run it? Yes, Margot said. It's more than a job for her. It's her heart. And if you give her the chance to keep it beating, you'll be saving more than a building. You'll be saving what this world has forgotten: decency, connection, grace. Rowan stared at her for a long moment. He wanted to say something practical, that it wasn't sound business, that profits didn't come from sentiment, but the words never made it out. Instead, he looked through the window again. He saw the chairs stacked neatly, the glow of the old jukebox bulb still flickering weakly. He saw Clara's reflection behind the counter, humming to herself as she cleaned. He realized it wasn't just a diner, it was a heartbeat, and it had been pulsing quietly unnoticed, waiting for someone to hear it. Margot spoke again, her tone quieter now. When I was your age, your grandfather used to tell me something. He said, wealth can build walls, but kindness builds bridges. You've spent your life building walls, Rowan. Maybe it's time you built something people can walk across. Those words hit deeper than he expected. The wind shifted around them, gentle now as though listening. Rowan looked at his mother, then at the diner, then back at her again. He finally nodded. All right, we'll save it. Margot's smile deepened, proud, relieved, maybe even a little wistful. You'll see, she said. It'll mean more than you think. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath vanish into the cold air. I suppose it already does. They stood there a while longer, neither in a hurry to leave. The lights inside the diner flickered one last time before going dark. For a brief moment, the sign outside, Maple Street Diner, glowed bright again, as if it too had heard their decision and approved. Rowan took one last look before opening the car door. Do you think she'll stay if we do this? He asked. Margot smiled faintly. She won't leave, Rowan. This place is in her bones. And now, thanks to you, it will stay in ours. He nodded, then helped her into the car. As they drove away, the snow began to fall again, light, almost shy this time, like a benediction from the sky itself. And behind them, in the diner that had somehow survived another storm, a faint hum of electricity pulsed through the sign. Its light flickers softly against the window. In that glow, the world seemed smaller, as if all the miles, all the years, all the noise of modern life had folded back into a single, quiet truth. That sometimes redemption doesn't come through power. It comes through return, through the act of remembering, through the courage to give something back to the place that once gave you warmth. And that night, Rowan Hale, the man who built empires, learned that the greatest thing he would ever build wasn't made of glass and steel, but of gratitude. The world had moved on by the time the storm melted away. The snow that once buried the town was gone now, leaving only puddles that shimmered with traces of the past. The roads were clear again. The people had returned to their routines, to work and noise and screens. But for one woman, the quiet hadn't left. For Clara Wynn, the silence had settled into her chest like something permanent. It had been 3 weeks since that strange night. 3 weeks since the old woman she'd sheltered had left with her son. The billionaire whose shoes didn't belong on diner floors and whose car looked like it belonged in another world. She hadn't heard from them since. Not a word. Sometimes, she wondered if they had ever really existed, or if she had dreamed them up on one of those long winter nights when the mind invents company to keep itself warm. The diner was closing today. The sale papers were ready to be signed. The owner had already packed his office, leaving behind nothing but old receipts and coffee stains. By noon, the electricity would be cut. And by evening, a contractor would come to board the windows. Clara came in early. She wanted to say goodbye properly. She moved through the diner slowly, touching everything the way you touch a photograph, gently, reverently, afraid it might dissolve if you hold it too long. She ran her fingers along the counter that had known every version of her life. She touched the jukebox that hadn't played a song in years, but still remembered how. She pressed her hand against the booth where the old woman had sat, where Margot Hale had smiled like someone remembering how to breathe again. The chair beside it was empty now, but Clara could still feel the warmth. The echo of a voice that had said, "This place raised me." She whispered into the stillness, "I'll miss you." She wasn't talking to anyone in particular, maybe to the diner, maybe to herself. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. When she turned toward the door, she stopped. Something was taped to the glass. A crisp white envelope, its corners neat. Its presence is strange in the dim morning light. The wind outside rattled it softly, as if urging her to notice. Clara hesitated before pulling it free. Her name was written across the front in careful ink. No address, no signature, just her name, Clara Wynn. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of letterhead paper. At the top, Hale Holdings. The same name she'd seen embossed on expensive magazines and billboards. The same name that had walked into her diner weeks ago in a black coat and polished shoes. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. Each line felt heavier than the last. Some places deserve a second chance. And so do the people who keep them alive. Her lips parted in disbelief. There was more, small print below, formal and final. Effective immediately, the ownership of Maple Street Diner is transferred to Hale Holdings under the management of Ms. Clara Wynn. She read it again, certain she'd misunderstood, but it said what it said. And at the bottom, in that same deliberate handwriting, were two names, Rowan Hale and Margot Hale. The paper slipped from her hand, fluttering gently to the floor. For a long time, she didn't move. She just stood there, the sound of the heater whispering in the background. The sunlight spilling across the counter is like gold. Then, finally, she laughed. A small laugh, quiet and disbelieving. The kind of laugh that only comes when life surprises you with grace. She picked up the letter again and pressed it to her chest. Tears fell before she could stop them, not out of sadness, but out of something rarer, relief, gratitude, homecoming. She turned toward the window. Outside, the morning light hit the old Maple Street Diner sign, and for the first time in years, the neon buzzed faintly. A soft, flickering heartbeat. Clara unlocked the front door and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue, and the world smelled of thaw and new beginnings. She looked at the letter again and smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. To no one, and yet to everyone who'd ever cared enough to help someone through a storm. Behind her, the diner door swung gently in the wind, and the sound it made, that little bell above the frame, rang like it did the first day she ever walked in. It was the same note, the same promise, the same reminder that even after everything ends, some places and some hearts are meant to stay. And as the sunlight warmed the snow that still clung to the sidewalk, Clara Wynn realized something she'd always known but never truly believed. That kindness does come back. Sometimes not in the way you expect, but always when you need it most. Winter came back almost quietly that year, as if it remembered how hard it had been the last time and didn't want to startle anyone. The air was gentler now, and the snow didn't roar. It drifted, soft and lazy, over a town that had learned something about second chances. At the edge of that town, the Maple Street diner glowed again. Its windows shone against the pale evening like open eyes that refused to close. The smell of fresh pie floated out onto the sidewalk, mingling with the clean scent of frost. Inside, voices filled the room. Children laughing over cocoa, an old couple sharing a booth that had seen more winters than they had left, the low clatter of plates keeping rhythm with an old jukebox that someone had finally repaired. And behind the counter stood Clara Wynn. Her apron was new, but her smile was the same. She moved with an ease that can't be taught, the kind that grows only from belonging. Every cup she poured, every greeting she offered, carried the quiet certainty of someone who had weathered her storm and come out shining. Sometimes, when the doorbell chimed and the wind pushed through, she would glance toward the window without meaning to, half expecting to see an elderly woman wrapped in a familiar coat. She never did, but she always smiled anyway. In some way, she could feel her there, in the light, in the hum of the heater, in the warmth that never left this place. At a corner booth near that same window sat Margot Hale. Her hair was whiter now, her movements slower, but her eyes carried the same spark that had once braved a blizzard. Across from her sat her son, Rowan, no longer the man who hid behind power. His phone stayed face down on the table. His laughter came easily, unpracticed but genuine. The townspeople had grown used to seeing him there, sipping coffee like everyone else, listening more than he spoke. The diner had become something of a miracle story in town. People said it had been saved by luck, or charity, or fate. But those who sat inside long enough knew better. It had been saved by memory, and by a waitress who believed that kindness should never clock out. Clara often thought about the night it all began. She remembered the storm's howl, the sight of an old woman framed by snow, the sound of that small voice saying, "Thank you." She could still feel the chill on her hands, the weight of that blanket, the tremble of fragile fingers holding a cup of tea. Every detail stayed with her, not as a burden but as a blessing. Because some memories don't fade, they ripen, turning into gratitude with age. Margot sometimes teased her, calling her manager, even though both of them knew the title meant something deeper. Clara didn't own the diner on paper, but she owned its heart. Under her care, it had bloomed again. Walls freshly painted, booths reupholstered, music softly humming through mornings and midnights. Each day, she kept a little vase of wildflowers on the counter. She said they were for the storm that started it all. Rowan had changed, too. He still ran his company, still wore suits that looked foreign in a place like this, but the hard edges were gone. He smiled more. He took fewer calls. Sometimes, when business brought him through town, he'd step behind the counter and pour coffee for strangers. He wasn't good at it, but that wasn't the point. He was trying to remember what it felt like to serve, not just to own. And Margot, she watched them both like a storyteller watching the final pages of her favorite book come to life. Every so often, she would glance at the window, the same one she had once stared through as a lost old woman, and whisper, "Still standing." It made Clara smile every time. As the evening settled, snow began to fall again. Outside, the town quieted under its gentle weight. Inside, the diner glowed brighter, defying the cold with laughter and light. Clara wiped down the counter, the same motion she had done 1,000 nights before. But this time, it didn't feel like routine. It felt like gratitude. She looked around at the faces, the warmth, the life reborn between those old walls, and thought of what Margot had once told her. Some storms don't come to break us. They come to remind us of what still matters. The clock ticked softly, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, the sign buzzed to life, Maple Street Diner, open late. The letters glowed pink and gold against the white night, like a promise whispered into the wind. And the narrator's voice, calm and remembering, spoke what the heart already knew. Sometimes fate doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the shape of a snowflake landing on an open palm. Sometimes it wears an old woman's smile and a stranger's kindness. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it leaves behind a place that feels like yesterday and tomorrow at once. A place that keeps its lights on when the world grows dark. Some storms come to destroy. Others come to remind us that love, warmth, and second chances are never really gone, just waiting patiently to be found again when the snow falls. In the end, storms don't make heroes. Choices do. Clara's kindness wasn't loud, but it lasted. If her story reminded you that strength comes quietly, tell someone who needs to hear it. Kindness, after all, is the story worth passing on. Like, share, and subscribe for more tales of resilience and heart.